The Holiday Letter. A Chestnut Creek Holiday Romance. Written by Susanne Ash. Chapter 1. Sophie. Some days I regret being raised better than to let out a string of curse words. Today is one of them. I stare at the tangled Christmas lights wrapped around an artificial evergreen garland. The thing is laying on top of the antique sorting desk that's been here for as long as anyone can remember. I should know. I'm a third-generation postmaster in Chestnut Creek, following in the footsteps of my father and grandfather. I'm sure both of them would have a good laugh, looking at me glaring at a pile of Christmas decorations. Sighing, I return to my task of untangling, feeling less than cheerful. The fact that one of the strings gets stuck in a small gap in the desk doesn't help either. Get out of there. I yank on the cord without success. While using my fingers to pry it out, they brush against a piece of paper. I lean in for a closer look. Sure enough, an old envelope is stuck in the back of one of the many cubbies that make up the desk. I gently pry it and the cord out. It's an old letter addressed to Elizabeth Townsend. I can't make out the postmark, but from the look of the paper and the intricate handwriting, it's been here for a while. Intrigued and half tempted to open the letter, I tuck it into my back pocket. I peek my head out of the door that leads from the back office to the main post office room. With Abby out sick and everyone else busy delivering holiday mail and packages, I'm on my own. Not that I mind. With no sign of Chestnut Creek residents requiring my attention, I get back to my task of untangling the lights. By the time the bell above the door chimes, the post office looks ready for the holiday season, and I'm in a decidedly better mood. A whoosh of chilly winter air rushes in along with Ben Harper, Chestnut Creek's latest addition. Doesn't it look festive in here? He looks around, pointing to the garland that spans the length of the counter and the small Christmas tree that sits in the corner. This town goes all out for the holidays, doesn't it? Always has. I smile at the history professor who moved to town a few months ago. How is the research for your book going? Not as fast as I'd like, but that's history for you. Ben leans against the counter, a boyish grin gracing his ruggedly handsome face. He runs his fingers through his unruly black curls. I'm not sure if it needs a haircut or a good brushing, but the man has distracted academic written all over him. You don't happen to have a package for me? As a matter of fact, I do. The heat rises in my cheeks. Abby attempted to deliver it 2 days ago, and it has been sitting in the back office ever since. Let me grab it. Thank you. Ben calls after me, his deep voice reverberating through my body. Good thing Abby isn't here. She'd give me a hard time for the secret crush I have on the nerdy professor. I lift the box on the counter and let it drop with a satisfying thud. What did you order? A ton of bricks? Ben chuckles. Close. Old books on American small-town traditions. A friend of mine came across them at an estate sale. Merry Christmas to you, I guess. I wonder if I should have slapped a bow on the package. Couldn't have asked for anything better, Ben says with a grin that makes the dimple in his left cheek appear. This could be exactly what I need. The man looks ready to tear into the box right here in front of me. Go ahead, I say. I don't mind if you open it here. I'll even recycle the box for you if you don't need it. Don't mind if I do. He pulls his keys out and uses them to cut the tape before pulling 3 leather-bound books from the box. They smell old and dusty, with a hint of mildew. Not the worst scent in the world. Are they everything you hoped for? I watch him flip through the pages, eyes gleaming with excitement. That and more. Ben's smile is as bright as the lights on the giant Christmas tree that graces the center of town this time of the year. I'm happy for you, I say. Remind me again what this project of yours is about? Ben puts the books down, arranging them in a neat little stack on the counter. I'm writing a book about how traditions shape community identity in small towns like Chestnut Creek. It sort of sits at the intersection of history and social science. Not something I can see becoming a New York Times bestseller, but something I'd pick up for a little light reading on the beach this summer. How far back do you go with these traditions? I ask, trying to judge the age of the books between us. As far back as I can. Here in Chestnut Creek, I've found some primary sources going all the way back to the late 17th century. Any interest in something slightly more recent? I ask, reaching for the envelope in my back pocket. Of course. I've been meaning to chat with you about the history of the post office. Your family has been connected to it for a few generations, hasn't it? Ben asks. The man has done his homework. 3 generations of postmasters, but our history here in town goes back further than that. I'd appreciate anything you can share, Ben says. I hold the letter out to him. I found this earlier today in an old desk in the back. He takes it from me, his fingers brushing against mine in the brief exchange. They are warm, unlike my hands, which stay cold as ice until the middle of May when the summer heat sets in. What is it? He asks. I'm guessing a lost letter. I'm not sure how old it is. I can't make out a postmark. He carefully examines both the front and back of the letter. Judging by the writing, I'd say the 19th century. Any idea who Elizabeth Townsend is? Or James Miller, he asks. James Miller? He's the sender. It's on the back. He shows me the faint ink scrawled across the reverse side of the envelope I overlooked earlier. There are a few Millers in town, but neither of the names rings a bell. I doubt either of them had done anything worthy of being mentioned in the town's history books. How would you feel about opening it? Ben asks, holding the letter between his index finger and thumb. I swallow hard. This goes against every rule I've sworn to uphold. But these are extenuating circumstances, and if our judgment about the age of the letter is even remotely correct, both of them have long been deceased. I don't think we'll learn anything else about this letter and its provenance unless we do. Ben holds it up to the light. Looks like a page of handwriting. A personal letter maybe? I weigh my options. The content could give me an idea of who these people were and possibly hold clues to who their descendants might be. Besides, if I'm perfectly honest, I've been itching to tear it open since the moment I found it. It couldn't hurt to open it. Before Ben can make further use of his car keys, I hold my hand out for the letter. Using the antique silver letter opener that was a gift from my grandmother on the day I passed the postal exam, I carefully cut the envelope open. Should we be using gloves? Ben shakes his head. I doubt the paper is that fragile. He watches me like a hawk as I slide the letter out and gently unfold it. Our heads almost touch as we both bend over the piece of paper, reading the scrawling script inked on it. Sounds like they were sweethearts, Ben mutters under his breath. James left town and asked her to wait for him. I wonder if she did. My eyes fly across the page. He planned to be gone for a year. That's a long time to ask someone to wait around for you. Not if you truly love someone. Ben raises and turns to stare out the window. Maybe not. I keep returning to the last line of the letter. James' voice is so full of longing and anguish to leave, it carries through to the present. My dearest Elizabeth, as I venture far from our beloved Chestnut Creek, every day apart will be shadowed by longing but brightened by the hope of my return. Hold steadfast in your heart the promise that I shall be back by next Christmas, ready to rebuild our dreams together. Wait for me, for my heart beats only for the moment I can return to you, never to wander again. Her last name sounds vaguely familiar, Ben says, pulling his phone from his pocket. It does? I asked, distracted by my own thoughts that remain with James. I wonder if he made it back to Chestnut Creek. Do you think we could find out what happened to them? If they ever saw each other again? Maybe. Ben scrolls across his screen. Here it is. There was a Townsend's mercantile here in town for close to 100 years. She must have been the daughter of one of the owners. He looks thoughtful. Does that mean there are other records about them? About her? My mind is whirling with the possibility of discovering what happened to James and Elizabeth. I would think so. I'm sure the library has records from back then. James, though. What are you thinking? Ben picks up the letter and reads it again. From the sound of it, they were in love and his intentions were to marry Elizabeth. For him to pack up and leave, her family must have been against the union. I can only think of a handful of reasons why that may be. And those are? I'm hanging on the man's lips, anxious for another clue to solve this historic mystery. The most likely is that he was of lower standing. A farmer's son is my best guess. People like Elizabeth's father were in high standing in a fledgling community like this back then. Without a merchant, there's no town. He'd want his daughter to marry someone of good standing. Someone with a lot of property. Or money. That's why James left, I say, my mind racing with the possibilities. To make his fortune and come back to ask for her hand. Something like that. Ben grins. Let's see what we can learn about these two lovebirds. I take the letter back, fold it, and carefully tuck it into the envelope. I'd appreciate that. What can I do? Let me start with the library. Unless you can think of another resource, he looks at me expectantly with those thoughtful green eyes of his. I might. Not exactly me, but there's someone who I think will have some ideas. Someone who would appreciate this letter as much as I do. Great. I'll see what I can find out on my end. Would you like to meet me at a regular Joe Saturday morning? He asks. Why not? How does 10 sound? I ask, hoping I'll be able to get away after the initial rush. It's a date. I tuck the letter into my bag as I watch Ben Harper walk out the door. My mind is racing with the possibilities of what we'll learn about James and Elizabeth. Returning to work, I can't help wondering what other stories the walls of my beloved post office may hold. How many letters like this have come and gone through this space? And how amazing is it that they can transcend time, carrying the emotions and stories from times long gone within them and connecting us to our past. I hum a festive tune while I look for my phone, excited to call my grandfather to tell him about the holiday letter I found.
Chapter 2. Ben. Cold air hits me the moment I step out of the post office. I wish I'd zipped up my jacket while I had the chance. The books make it impossible unless I'd be willing to set them down. Which isn't happening. Their leather bindings look in surprisingly good shape. Instead, I pick up speed, striding through town toward the small craftsman house I'm renting for the year. My mind is on the spunky postmaster and the historical mystery she discovered. Sophie Martin first caught my eye when I inquired about my forwarded mail. She didn't strike me as much of a history buff then, but maybe I was wrong. Either way, this letter is the perfect opportunity to spend a little more time with the petite brown-eyed beauty that hides behind the counter of the historical post office. I shake my head, trying to dispel the mental picture of her. I'm not here looking for love. The town simply seemed like a convenient spot to dig deeper into Appalachian culture and its significance in shaping tight-knit communities that survived until the present day. Getting ready for Christmas, an elderly woman I remember seeing around town asks. She's carrying a holiday wreath in one hand, using a cane with the other to steady herself. Getting there, I hedge. Would you like help with that? She shakes her head. I'm more spry than I look. Besides, it looks to me like you have your hands full already. A little light evening reading? I chuckle. Something like that. We walk side by side for a few yards until she takes her leave, heading down a side street. I make my way further down Main, noticing the various holiday displays in the windows of the businesses that line the street. The residents of Chestnut Creek go all out for Christmas. I see trees going up and a crew of city workers is busy stringing up lights and holiday-themed flags along the major thoroughfares. Some of the flag designs feel historic and, for the first time, I wonder if it's worth looking into some of these traditions and see if they may tie back into my research. When I notice a flyer about a candlelight walk through town, I pick it up and shove it between the pages of one of the books, barely avoiding dropping the set. Are you joining us for the walk? Margaret Jameson, the owner of the local inn, asks. I startle, almost dropping my precious cargo for the second time in as many moments. Considering it. Do you think it will be worth my while? I ask. I like the older woman who made my stay in town until I found the rental house bearable. I can't think of anyone in town who'd get more joy out of it, Margaret says. Aside from Mrs. Clayton. In that case, consider me in attendance. I nod and say my goodbyes, eventually making it home with all 3 books intact. My place is coming together. I set down the books and shrug out of my boots and jacket. I make myself a cup of herbal tea, shelving the new-to-me volumes while it brews. I carry the steaming mug to the desk that takes up the better part of my living room and look over my notes from this morning. I should work on the next chapter of my book. Instead, I decide to make a few notes about Sophie's letter. I should have asked her to let me take it back here, I say into the silent void that's my home. Not that I think she'd let me. Sophie seemed surprisingly protective of the simple piece of Chestnut Creek history. I could at least have taken a picture. Not ideal, but better than going by memory. Torn between diving back into my research or this new mystery, I decide to head to the local library to look for any trace of Elizabeth Townsend and James Miller. Back for more already, the head librarian asks when I request permission to review the microfiche records of Old Town newspapers. I found a new lead. Could you help me dig up anything on the Townsend store and the family who ran it? I ask. Of course. I'm sure it's mentioned in a few of the old records. She makes a note before setting me up at the now familiar desk where I spend the hours until the library closes scanning old newspaper articles. Any luck? She asks when I return to the resource desk. Better than expected. I hold up the notes I've made. I found quite a few mentions of the Townsend business and the family who ran it. Unfortunately, there wasn't a single mention of the Millers. The most surprising find has been an announcement of engagement I can't wait to share with Sophie on Saturday. Good for you. She hands me a stack of printouts I'd requested as I worked my way through several years' worth of newspaper editions. I pay my print fees and walk home with a new pep in my step, regretting the fact that I neglected to ask Sophie for her number. Keeping the clue I found to myself is proving surprisingly challenging. I look around the cozy coffee shop for any sign of Sophie. No luck. Which shouldn't come as much of a surprise. I'm a good 20 minutes early for our date. What can I get you? Joe, the owner of the establishment, asks. Coffee, black, I say. I'm waiting for a friend. Joe nods. Coming right up. I look around and by the time Joe pours me a cup, I have a seat picked out. It's a table by a window toward the back of the building, away from the crowd. I'm almost finished with my coffee and have papers spread out across the table when Sophie walks in. She spots me and waves, making a beeline for the counter. By the time she joins me, I have my paperwork organized in a neat little stack. My fingers itch to shove the first few newspaper clippings her way. Good morning. Looks like you've been busy. She flips her hair and slides into the seat across from me. I found a few things at the library. I point to the leather messenger bag she drops beside her. How about you? Sophie adjusts herself in her seat and takes a sip of the sweet-smelling, coffee-like concoction she ordered. She sighs before answering. I was able to wrestle up a few things. You first, though. Her slender fingers wrap around the white porcelain mug as she looks at me with those brown eyes that I can't seem to get out of my head. I clear my throat and fan the photocopies out in the space between us. There were quite a few mentions of the Townsends and their store in the papers. Some advertisements, store expansions, the type of thing you'd expect. Sophie looks over them, picking a few of the pages up for a closer look. And then there's this. I hand her my biggest find and hold my breath. Her expression morphs from mildly interested to surprised, eyes growing wide as they dance across the page. Elizabeth got engaged? I nod. To a man named Charles Edgeworth. From what I can tell, he was the manager of the town's bank. A better match than James, Sophie says thoughtfully. At least on paper. Look at the date. September 1822, Sophie reads. She didn't wait for him. I watched the significance of it sinking in. Do we know if she went through with it? Sophie asks. The marriage to this Charles guy? Not that I've been able to find in the old newspaper editions. Not all of them survived and we can't be sure there was another notice posted in it. I had the same thought. We could check the old church registers. Sophie opens her bag and pulls out a notepad. She scribbles another line on a page already full of notes. That was my big discovery so far, I say, glimpsing a few of the contents of her bag. How about you? What did you find? A warm smile spreads across Sophie's face. She pulls several old maps from her bag along with a register of sorts and a stack of faded black and white photographs. I went to see my grandfather, she says. He was a postmaster as well and still keeps the archive. There's quite a bit that's been passed down over the years. I unroll the first of the maps. It's an old one of the town and fascinating to look at. The core of the town is the same, but much of what I would now consider the outskirts of Chestnut Creek was farmland back then. If you look up north and a bit east from the church, I think you'll see a familiar name. She points to the spot in question. I lean closer to make out the small writing. John Miller. He's got to be related to James. Sophie flips open the register. He is. He's James's father. And from what I can tell, the farm was passed down to John Jr. I take the book from her and scan the entries. The dates line up. That would make James at least a second son. Sophie nods, looking pleased with herself. She takes another sip of her coffee. My own cup sits forgotten off to the side. I'm too drawn in by the documents in front of me and the story they tell. The Miller farmstead isn't large enough to divide between the sons. That's what I'm thinking. I'm guessing James had to go off to make his own fortune. That's why he left and asked Elizabeth to wait for him. Question is, why didn't she? My mind races with possibilities. Any idea on where to find the answer? Sophie looks at me. I'm not sure. I'll have a look around for more primary sources, but to be perfectly honest, we may never know. There's a lot that's missing and most of the stories like Elizabeth's got lost over time. It's my greatest source of frustration as a historian. We're not giving up though, right? She reaches across the table as if to grab my hand, but pulls back at the last moment. Instead, she splays her fingers across the map she brought. I smile, loving her eagerness and the chance to spend more time with her. Not at all. I'm just trying to manage expectations. Don't get my hopes up, she says. Got it. I roll up the maps. Mind if I hang on to this for a few days? I'd like to dig a little deeper into the names of neighbors and see what I can find out. Not at all. Sophie hands me the register as well. When I talked to my grandfather, he remembered the Townsends and a Miller family. Nothing concrete, and I'm sure the people he knew were at least a century removed from James and Elizabeth, but they could be related. Lots of folks stick around for generations, don't they? I say as much to myself as to her. They do. Sophie gazes at me. What are you thinking? I wonder if it would be worth reaching out to some of the elderly residents here in Chestnut Creek. See what they remember. Especially those with strong generational ties to this place. Sophie turns and stares out the window. That could work. I know most of them. There are a few people I could reach out to. I shut the register and down the last of my coffee. Great. We have a plan. And I have some work to do. Sophie turns to look at the clock on the wall. So do I. I should head back to the post office. When she stands, I find myself reluctant to part ways. Mind if I walk with you? You can tell me more about who you think would be worth interviewing. She slings her bag across her shoulder and gives me the most dazzling smile. I'd like that.
Chapter 3. Sophie. Abby, would you mind emptying the mailboxes on Main? I ask, when we clear the small crowd of customers who'd stopped by first thing this morning. Not at all. Back in a jiffy. She shrugs into her winter coat and grabs a stack of bins before heading out the front door. Hey, Walter, how have you been? I look up and see her chatting with my grandfather. The old man is wrapped in a hat and scarf Grandma knitted for him. Fine. Fine. How about you? Finally feeling better, he asks. Thanks to your wife's elderberry syrup. I swear that stuff is magic. Abby waves and dashes off. Grandpa, what are you doing here? I ask when he approaches the counter. I have a couple of last-minute Christmas cards that need to go out. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out 2 envelopes. You didn't have to come all the way over here for that. I smile at the old man who knows full well I would have picked them up if he'd called. Grandma was ready for me to leave the house for a bit, and I had a few other errands to run. Besides, can't I come see my favorite granddaughter, he asks. I smile and hold my hand out for the letters. I'm your only granddaughter. Doesn't make it any less true. I glance at the addresses. I'm pretty sure I already processed cards to both of these distant family members for him. Biting my tongue, I drop them into the outgoing mail bin under the counter. Can I interest you in a cup of coffee? I was about to put on a fresh pot. Don't mind if I do. Grandpa walks behind the counter and shrugs out of his winter coat. And I wouldn't mind seeing where you found this mysterious letter of yours. I chuckle. His request doesn't come as a big surprise. In the old sorting desk. I'll show you. While the coffee is brewing, I point out the exact spot. He bends down, examining the pieces of wood closely, his reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. Can't believe I never noticed it in all my time here. I wouldn't either if the cord for the Christmas lights hadn't gotten stuck in there. No excuse. I have decorated Christmas trees here more times than I can count. Grandpa pounds his fist on the desk. And I've gotten worse things stuck than a little green cord. I cough to keep from laughing. I think the coffee is ready. About time, he grunts. Let me see that letter again, would you? He sits in the wooden office chair that's almost as old as the antique desk, and suddenly I have no problem picturing him in my position all those years ago. I pull the letter out of my bag and hand it to him before pouring us each a cup of coffee. I wonder how it made it to the post office. There's no stamp and no postmark on the envelope. Grandpa examines it carefully, undoubtedly looking for any other clues. Clues that aren't there. I've pulled it out to look at the faded paper more times than I can count. I asked myself the same question. Any news from your historian friend? Grandpa asks, taking the cup of coffee. I shake my head. Not much. He found a notice of engagement for Elizabeth with some other guy. That's better than nothing. I'm sure between the two of you, you'll dig something else up. He looks at me across the steaming cup. We'll see. We spend a pleasant few minutes drinking our coffee and chatting about family Christmas preparations. I should be going, Grandpa says, putting the cup down next to the faded letter. Grandma will be waiting with lunch. Tell her I'll drop by this weekend to see her, I say. To see both of you. Grandpa smiles, the wrinkles on his face deepening. That'll be nice, but if you're too busy with your detective work, we both understand. I laugh. I'm never too busy to come by for a visit. Good to know. Grandpa shrugs into his coat. It's nice seeing you like this. Like what? Excited. He wraps his scarf around his neck before tucking it into the jacket. Full of life. I wonder if it has something to do with a certain young historian. Only Grandpa would call a guy in his mid-30s young. The heat rises into my cheeks. Speaking of which, Grandpa says, you may want to have a chat with Mrs. Clayton. I ran into the old girl yesterday and told her about the letter. She said something about remembering a story of star-crossed lovers in the early days. Mind you, it might have nothing to do with that letter of yours, but it couldn't hurt having a chat. Between you and me, she could use the company. So could quite a few other elderly residents. I'll go see her soon, I promise. No time like the present. Grandpa kisses me on the cheek and heads out, leaving me to ponder his comments about Ben. When Abby makes it back, I'm ready for a bit of fresh air. And maybe he's right, there is no time like the present. Would you mind manning the counter for a bit? I ask my colleague. I have a couple of errands to run. Not at all. Abby pours herself the last of the coffee and settles in. I tuck the letter back into my bag and head to Mrs. Clayton's house, feeling more excited and alive than I have in years as the chilled air hits my cheeks. The elderly woman ushers me inside and has me settled with a cup of hot chocolate and a plate of homemade Spritz cookies before I can catch my breath. "I heard you found a love letter to the Townsend girl," Mrs. Clayton says, nibbling on a cookie. "I did. I have it here, if you'd like to see it." I produce the letter and hand it to her. The Townsends were one of the founding families of Chestnut Creek, and the mercantile was what made the town. "There are a few old pictures of it from back in the day," she says, searching for her reading glasses before taking a closer look at the contents of the letter. "I'd love to see them." I grab another buttery cookie, unable to resist the sweet treat. "My grandfather said you remembered hearing about a story from back then." Mrs. Clayton nods, her eyes not leaving the letter. "I was a young girl when my great-grandmother told me about Elizabeth and her suitors. I remember how sad I felt for her when her true love disappeared without a trace. She got engaged, I think, and when that engagement was broken, it was the talk of the town." I pull a small notepad from my bag and scribble furiously as Mrs. Clayton shares everything she recalled. It isn't much, but enough to get me excited. Leaving her home, I can't help feeling excited. We're getting closer to finding out what happened to Elizabeth and James. I pull out my phone, and Ben answers on the second ring. "I'm glad you called. I have news," he says. "So do I." I glance at my watch. I've been gone longer than I realized. "I have to head back to work, but I'd love to meet later, if you're free." "How about dinner?" Ben asks. "Unless that's too forward of me." "Dinner would be nice," I say. "The Chestnut Tavern at 7? We arrive at the cozy eatery at the same time and walk in together. I wait until we are settled in a booth before I launch into a retelling of my meeting with Mrs. Clayton. "Are the two of you ready to order?" our server asks. For the second time today, my cheeks turn pink, and this time it has nothing to do with the handsome man sitting across from me. He looks as embarrassed as I feel. "We got distracted. Can we have a minute to look at the menu?" Ben asks. "Of course. Take your time." "Anything to drink in the meantime?" the server asks. "Water for now." I pick up the menu and scan through the familiar offerings. "What's good here?" Ben asks. I laugh. "Everything. You can't go wrong at the Chestnut Tavern. It all depends on what you're in the mood for." I end up choosing chicken and dumplings, my favorite comfort food, and Ben goes with one of their thick-cut pork chops with a side of pan-fried potatoes and roasted Brussels sprouts. With the order out of the way, I can't contain my curiosity any longer. "What did you learn that made you so excited to meet tonight?" I ask, taking a sip of my ice water. "I needed a reason to have dinner with you?" Ben asks with a grin that brings out his dimple. "Not exactly, but you said you had news to share." I sit back and watch the grin disappear along with the dimple. "Right. I did some more digging into the banker and the mercantile. Elizabeth's father and Mr. Edgeworth were close friends. From the looks of it, he was closer to her father's age than hers." Ben slid a copy of an old photograph my way. It depicted a group of men in front of the old town hall building that's still standing. Names were scribbled on the image, including those of Mr. Townsend and Mr. Edgeworth, standing side by side. "This doesn't prove they were more than acquaintances," I say, studying the image carefully. "It would make sense that they were both involved in the building. But this does." He slides another old newspaper clipping across the oak table. The article talks about the financing for the building of the town hall and how it became possible thanks to the close friendship of the two men depicted in the image. Point taken. So poor Elizabeth is forced to marry her father's business buddy instead of waiting for James. That's what it seems like. Though I'm wondering if there's more to the story than that. We go through everything else we've discovered, taking notes and hoping to find a new lead, something we've overlooked. Before we know it, our food arrives. Ben gathers the papers scattered across the table. "You know, Mrs. Clayton agrees with you," I say, dipping my spoon into the big bowl of chicken and dumplings. "She thinks it broke the young woman's heart when the love of her life vanished without a trace." Except James didn't. He wrote the letter. Ben picked up his cutlery and dug in with gusto. Her story might have nothing to do with our two lovebirds. I'll go back and see if she remembers any details. I think she'll be at the candlelight walk tomorrow night, Ben says. I was thinking of going. Would you like to join me? I bite back a smile. It is one of the most romantic events of the season and something I try not to miss. Having someone to walk alongside that I'm not related to would make it even more special. I'd love to. He looks up, and the dimple is back. I look forward to it. So do I. It's been nice sitting here, sharing our findings and having a good meal together. It's a fun event. I think you'll like it. The local historical society has been putting it on for at least the past 50 years. I remember going there since I was a little girl. Did you say historical society? Ben asks, his head shooting up, fork held midway between the plate and his mouth. Yes, why? Chestnut Creek has a historical society? He puts his fork down, his full attention on me. It's the first I've heard of it. What can you tell me about it? Who's in it? Where do they meet? It's a small group of elderly residents. I try to think. I don't think it's a big deal or anything. Oh, it's a very big deal. Ben sits back and takes a sip of his water. Some of my most significant finds have come from groups like this. I looked around when I first moved here and didn't see any signs of one. Usually they run a little history museum and keep the town archives. No museum and as far as I know, but their main activity is the candlelight walk each Christmas. I try to think back. There may be walking tours in the summer, too, for tourists, but I'm not sure. If they keep an archive, they could have records we haven't come across yet, Ben says. What kind of records? I ask, getting caught up in his excitement. Private letters and diaries, Ben says. Who knows? They may have been in possession of the letter before it made its way into that old sorting desk of yours. Over 2 orders of banana pudding for dessert, we make a list of questions to ask the members of the Historical Society. When we leave and Ben walks me to my car, I'm more excited than I have been in years to go on the candlelight walk. See you Friday, Ben says. He waits for me to shut the door and crank up the car, only heading to his own vehicle after I pull out of the parking lot.
Chapter 4. Ben. You're that historian working with my granddaughter, aren't you? I look up at an elderly gentleman wearing a thick wool sweater and corduroy pants. He stands behind the second chair of the small table of the coffee shop I'm occupying yet again. Mind if I join you? He doesn't wait for a response before putting down his coffee and pulling out the chair. Not at all. I shut my notebook and pull my own cup of coffee closer. You must be Sophie's grandfather. The old postmaster and keeper of maps. I am. And I see she's shared them with you. His curled finger taps on one of them. She did. I hope you don't mind. Not at all. I'm glad all that stuff I've been holding on to is of use. He grins, revealing pearly white dentures. The wife wanted to throw them out years ago, but I wouldn't let her. These documents have been passed down from one postmaster to the next. I'm surprised they aren't kept at the post office. I sit back and sip my lukewarm coffee. They used to be, Mr. Martin says. Between you and me, I didn't trust my son, Sophie's father, with them. How come? He's into modernizing and digitizing everything. I'm surprised the old sorting desk where Sophie found the letter survived his tenure. The old man is full of surprising information. I'm not sure which thread to pull first. What is he doing now? Mr. Martin chuckles. He got promoted. Works in Asheville and couldn't be happier. And your granddaughter stepped into your footsteps, I say. He nods thoughtfully. Best thing that could have happened. She cares about this town, its people, and its history. I noticed. More than I ever expected to. I can't get the woman out of my head. She's a good kid, Mr. Martin says. He looks at me with an intensity that makes me shift in my seat. Which is why I'm wondering. I swallow hard. What are your intentions towards my granddaughter? His question doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is how hard it is to vocalize my feelings for Sophie. Everything's so new. I'm enjoying spending time with her. The old man chuckles, amused by my bashfulness. Enjoy spending time with her, eh? I do. She's smart and funny, and we share a lot of similar interests. So I heard. Is any of this helping with that mystery letter of hers? Mr. Martin asks. We're making progress. Not as much as I'd like, but what can you expect after all this time? I appreciate that you're not making this all about yourself. I know how you professorial types can get. He eyes me again. Unless you have a different end goal in mind. Like I said, we are friends who enjoy spending time together, caught up in the mystery of the letter. Walter, leave the man alone. Margaret walks up to the table, carrying a large coffee to go. I don't mind, I say, motioning for her to join us. Mr. Martin has been quite helpful. Without these old maps, we wouldn't know for sure that James came from a humble farming background. I heard about this little mystery of yours. Margaret pulls up a chair and sits down. Are you getting any closer to finding out if these two ended up together? I shake my head. Nothing yet. I scoured the resources at the library and looked through every church register from back then I could get my hands on. No notice of Elizabeth getting married. Margaret reaches across the table and pats my hand, reacting to the frustration I haven't been able to keep out of my voice. As my late husband used to say, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Was he a scientist? I ask, surprised by the quote. Margaret laughs and Mr. Martin chuckles. No, dear. He volunteered with the fire department. I see. I adjust the collar of my shirt. Why don't you talk to Mrs. Caldwell at the candlelight walk tonight? Margaret suggests. She might have some ideas. That's the plan. I gather my things and rise, taking my leave. Ready to do this? Sophie asks when I meet her in front of the post office. I am. I hold out my arm and we set off down the sidewalk to the first stop, the old Episcopal church. I heard you had a nice chat with my grandfather this morning, she says, easily keeping pace with my long strides. I laugh. I sure did. I guess he couldn't wait to call you after. Sophie shakes her head, her brown ponytail swaying from one side to the other. Margaret stopped by the post office this afternoon. What did she tell you? I ask, spotting Sophie's grandfather at the bottom of the church steps surrounded by a small group of people. Only that she had to come to your rescue, Sophie waves at the group of people. That's my mom and dad over there. And my grandma. She introduces me to her family, all of whom I meet with suspicion. I don't doubt I have her grandfather to thank for that. Ben here has been helping our Sophie with her research into that old love letter she found at the post office, Mr. Martin says, his voice booming and drawing the attention of everyone around. Ladies and gents, an elderly man dressed in a long coat and top hat called out. Please take your candles and light them. We leave in 10 minutes. Sophie lets out a sigh of relief and takes my hand like it's the most natural thing in the world. She pulls me to the fold-out table and hands me one of the white pillar candles. We light them on the candles her parents are already holding and set off on our walk through town. Our first stop is the church where we've gathered. The man in the top hat gives a brief speech about the history of the congregation and the building, including the fact that the first service ever held inside was on Christmas Eve 1821. What do you think the chances are Elizabeth and James attended? Sophie asks, her voice barely a whisper accompanied by a puff of white smoke in the chilly evening air. Pretty good, I'd think. I study the architecture of the building. Even if this wasn't their denomination, I'm sure they would have come here for special services like this. I make a mental note to step inside later this week and find out about this year's holiday services. Good to know. Sophie walks beside me as we stroll from the church to a building that used to house a livery back in the day. Today, it's a small boutique on one side and a restaurant on the other. I doubt a lot of residents know that they are eating their burgers in a space once occupied by horses. We both listened to the presentation along with the rest of the group before continuing our walk around town. I keep an eye out for Mrs. Caldwell, eager to speak to the elderly widow about the next step in our journey to discover the fate of James and Elizabeth. I don't spot her for quite some time, but the candlelight walk is surprisingly informative and entertaining. And the company isn't bad either. I enjoy watching Sophie absorbed into the event and walking beside me. Fighting the urge to take her hand, I shove mine in the pockets of my coat. "Sophie, I was hoping to run into you," Mrs. Caldwell says after she gives her speech at one of the historical buildings. "And we were hoping to talk to you about something," Sophie said, motioning for me to join her. "Let me guess, it's about this mystery love letter you found." The elderly woman smiles kindly at her, and Sophie nods. "We heard you are part of a historical society here in town, and I was told you are the person we should speak to about any possible primary and secondary sources from back then." I watch her carefully. The smile widens. "Oh, that we do. Plenty of journals and letters that have been passed down through the generations." It sounds like a treasure trove. Sophie sounds as excited as I feel. "I guess you could call it that," Mrs. Caldwell says before raising a gloved hand to cover a yawn. "Any chance we could see it tonight? I know it's a big ask, but I can't wait to see what we can find in those documents." Mrs. Caldwell chuckles and shakes her head. "It's a little late for that. But I can introduce you to some of the other members of the society. Most of them are here." She does just that, and we spend a pleasant half an hour getting to know them. "Do you mind if I ask where your archive is kept?" I ask as the conversation winds down. "Not at all." Mrs. Caldwell points back in the direction we came from moments ago. "They are in the attic of the old town hall. Why don't you meet us there tomorrow morning and we can show you around," a gentleman from the group says. "Maybe around 9? That would be amazing," I say before thinking of checking with Sophie. I turn to look at her, and to my relief, she nods her agreement. 9 it is. We better get home then. It's getting late and my bones are cold and tired, Mrs. Caldwell says. The group disperses, and Sophie takes leave from her family. "Can I walk you home?" I ask, pulling my coat closer around me. "Or your car? Whichever is closer." Sophie laughs. "I'm 2 roads up and a block over. That's close to my place." I glance in the direction she indicated. I can't believe we've practically been neighbors all this time. We walk quickly, barely speaking despite the excitement about the discoveries the morning may bring. "This is me." Sophie points to a small brick house with a covered front porch. "Nice place." I study the building. "How old is it?" "It's from the 20s. Not nearly as old as any of the places we visited tonight. But historical, nevertheless." Sophie nods. "It's why I bought it. The house is small, but it's mine. And it has 2 original fireplaces." I'm tempted to ask her to see them, but it's far too late and far too soon. She grows quiet, but makes no move to enter her home. "I enjoyed myself tonight," I say after clearing my throat. My heart beats faster than it has since the last time I attempted to go for a run. "I did, too." Sophie's eyes connect with mine. The street lamps reflect on them like stars. "I should head in." I nod and neither of us moves until I take a step forward to close the distance between us. Her breath hitches and her eyes flutter closed. I miss the sparkles, but rejoice in the silent invitation. Raising my hand, I brush a strand of her hair out of her face. It's as silky and soft as I've imagined. A soft moan escapes her lips, barely audible as I lower my head, my breath washing over her face. My lips are so close to hers I feel their warmth when a set of lights appears and puts us on display. Sophie flinches, her eyes flying open as the car drives past us. I step back, sucking in a breath to steady myself. "I really should go inside and let you get home," Sophie says, with as much regret as I feel. "You should." I take another step back. "Good night, Sophie." Good night. The dropping temperatures are a welcome reprieve as I make my way to my own place.
Chapter 5. Sophie. Morning, boss, Abby says when she walks in the door, bringing with her a swell of frosty December air. Good morning. There's coffee if you want it. I point to the room in the back. What kind of question is that? Abby laughs. And what has you in such a good mood today? My cheeks warm at the recollection of the moment Ben and I shared on my porch. Nothing much. I went to the candlelight walk last night. By the way, you don't mind if I step out for a couple of hours once we get this morning's deliveries sorted, do you? Of course not. It's a Saturday morning. After the first rush to get last-minute holiday packages out, it should be quiet. Abby shrugs out of her jacket and heads to the back. My thoughts exactly. What are you up to? Last-minute Christmas shopping? Abby asks, taking a seat beside me. She picks up a box of letters that were dropped off overnight and starts sorting them. Not quite. Ben and I are meeting the members of the Historical Society. I get up and pour myself a fresh cup of coffee. You and Ben have been spending quite a bit of time together, haven't you? Abby asks. I saw you at the tavern the other night. I'm grateful I'm out of sight when the warmth creeps into my cheeks. He's helping me solve the mystery of the old love letter. I know. I think the whole town does. Abby looks at me expectantly when I return. And there are some rumors swirling around about you and the handsome historian. I almost choke on my coffee and cough. Abby waits patiently for me to regain my composure. Spill, she says when my breathing returns to normal. There isn't much to tell. We enjoy working together. I shrug. And? Abby raises an eyebrow. He walked me home last night, I say, resigning myself to the fact that my cheeks will stay blushed permanently at this rate. After the candlelight walk. And? He almost kissed me goodnight. Oh. Abby actually looks surprised. What happened? How do you feel about it? Do you want to kiss him? I hold up my hand to stop the rapid-fire questions. Once Abby gets on a roll, it's hard to get a word in. A car drove by and we both took a step back. I'm not completely sure how I feel about any of this. I think maybe we were getting caught up in James and Elizabeth's love story. That's the couple from the letter? Abby asks. Are you making any progress? I nod. We are. We've been doing a lot of research and I hope we'll find even more to dig into this morning. It's nice to see you this excited and passionate about something other than work, Abby says with a smile. I shrug. It all started here and Ben has high hopes we can find out what happened to those two. It sounds like quite the love story. Abby looks at me. Maybe more than one. Maybe we got swept up in the moment, I say, doubt creeping in. Or maybe it's time you found true love, Abby says. Speaking of time, I better go unlock the front door. We spend the next 2 hours taking care of customers and sorting letters and packages. By the time I leave, the biggest surge is taken care of, and Abby assures me she can handle the rest. Call me if you need me. I'm not going far, I promise as I walk out the door. I meet Ben on the front steps of the old town hall. He's as excited as I am to see what the Historical Society has to share with us. Ready? Ben asks, holding the door open for me. I nod and step inside. The air is musky, like the place could use some airing out. It's been ages since I've been inside this building. You've been here before? Ben walks up beside me and we both stare at the old brick walls and wooden window frames. Paint is chipping off most of them and a few of the light bulbs are burned out. A long time ago, I say. For a school trip. I think we looked at some old maps and documents then, but to be honest, I don't remember much. Ben grins. I wonder what you looked like as a child. I laugh. I was all pigtails and freckles. Nothing impressive. I'm sure you were an adorable little girl. Ben's eyes soften. Before I can respond, Mrs. Caldwell walks down the worn steps and greets us. Let me introduce you to everyone else. We follow her up 2 flights of stairs to the attic of the old town hall. I'm slightly out of breath and wonder how the people gathered in the large space made it up here. They all look to be in their 70s or older, and every one of them is welcoming us with a friendly smile. We pulled a few sources you might be interested in, an older gentleman I recognize from last night says. He points to a large table full of books, journals, and letters. There's a lot more than I expected. I walk over and shuffle through some of the papers. I couldn't agree more. There's more here than I could have hoped for, Ben says, sounding surprised. It'll take a while to sort through all of this. Don't look so surprised, Mrs. Caldwell says. Or worried. We're here to help and made a good start on sorting through it. In that case, let's get to work. He takes a stack of journals and looks around for a place to sit. I follow suit, and we spent a pleasant couple of hours scanning documents the members of the Historical Society brought out for us. Throughout the morning, I can't help glancing over at Ben. It's fascinating watching him in his natural element, analyzing historical texts and taking copious notes. A warm smile spreads across his face when he catches me looking at him, and I can't think of a better way to spend a Saturday morning. Would you mind sharing what you've learned so far? The president of the Historical Society asks when we take a break. I wouldn't mind seeing the letter, Mrs. Caldwell says, opening a box of cookies. Another member brought coffee in a large thermos, and she passes it around along with a stack of paper cups. We don't mind at all. Ben pulls the letter from his briefcase. Would you like me to read it out loud? The group nods, and everyone gathers around, sipping coffee and listening intently. Ben's voice fills the room and brings the contents of the letter alive in a way that surprises me. I can see James, hunched over a small desk, penning the note to his beloved. The Townsend connection is obvious, but is anyone familiar with the Millers? Mrs. Caldwell asks. A few members shake their heads. The old Miller homestead isn't far from here. Ben pulls the map out and points to the spot. It can't be. Betty Harrow, an elderly widow we met last night, stands up, visibly shaken. She has her hand clasped to her chest and her face has gone white. Betty, what's wrong? Mrs. Caldwell rushes to her side. I only now realized, the woman lets Mrs. Caldwell guide her to the small sofa that's pushed against the back wall. What did you realize? I rush to her side, sensing that this is important. Ben is 2 steps behind me. I know the story. At least I think I do. My grandmother told me about her great-uncle and the woman he loved. I never realized she was a Townsend. Or that he was a Miller until you showed me the spot on the map. Miss Betty shook her head. There's a shop there now, but it's the building I was born in. The house my great-grandfather built. And the land belonged to the Millers since James's father farmed there. Ben sits down beside her and takes her frail hands in his. From what little I remember, it was a story of lost love and heartbreak. I knew there was a letter that had gotten lost. I didn't know what happened to it until now. I think I saw something in one of the journals about a lost letter, the gentleman who had started us on our tour last night says. I rise to my feet and follow him to a stack of discarded books. He sorts through them before handing me a leather-bound journal. I scan through the pages before handing it to Ben. Is it James's? He studies it carefully. It's likely. The age is right and you can barely make out the initials JM. I glance at my watch. It's high time for me to get back to the post office. What's our next step? Sort through the rest of the documents and see if there's anything we can find out about James and Elizabeth's lives. I'll start reading through this. Ben takes the journal and sits down beside Miss Betty. Watching him interact with the elderly woman, showing her an entry, I realize how deeply I care for the man. Is there any chance I could take this back with me for a couple of days? Ben asks as we get ready to leave. Mrs. Caldwell looks around the room for approval and nods. The glint in Ben's eyes hint that for him, Christmas came early this year.
Chapter 6. Ben. The journal I borrowed from the Historical Society is fascinating. I take another look in the early morning light, more convinced than I was yesterday that it is, in fact, James Miller's. I'm deep into transcribing a particularly interesting passage on my laptop when the doorbell rings. Mrs. Caldwell, please come in. It's freezing out there. I usher the elderly woman inside. She's bundled up in a thick coat, hat, and scarf, carrying her ever-present purse and a large tote bag. Isn't it? She says. We're going to have another big snowstorm. I can feel it in my bones. Another? The power outage the last one brought had been less than pleasant. Afraid so. She shrugs out of her coat, and I take it from her. Can I get you some coffee? I ask. That would be lovely. And it'll go nicely with the cookies I brought you, Mrs. Caldwell says. Along with these. She hands me a stack of letters. The paper is torn and the ink fading. I scan through them while the coffee brews. Each of them contains a reference to either the Millers, the Townsends, or Charles Edgeworth, Elizabeth's fiancé. We were all touched by Betty's story, and after you left, we each went back to the archives. This is what we found. Mrs. Caldwell accepts the cup I offer her and opens the tin of Christmas cookies. I can't tell you how much this means to Sophie and me. I sit back and look at the woman in front of me. We feel the same way. And it would be wonderful if we could give Betty a little more information. Mrs. Caldwell sits up and puts down her cup. We grew up in a time when everyone knew everyone else in Chestnut Creek. That's slowly changing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but as descendants of the founding families leave, much will be lost. I nod. You're right. Miss Betty has a direct connection with her through her grandmother. Younger people don't. If we can capture those memories now, we might be able to trace quite a bit of information back to the town's origins. Mrs. Caldwell smiles. That would be lovely. Maybe you can put it into one of those books of yours and preserve it for posterity. I smile. That's the plan. And the reason I've been busy transcribing James's journal. Mrs. Caldwell reaches over and pats my arm. It's nice seeing young folk like you and Sophie taking an interest in this. It brings joy to my heart. It has been a long time since anyone has called me young. It's nice to feel part of something. You are, aren't you? The elderly woman eyes me curiously. You've made a home here. She isn't wrong. It is starting to feel that way. This house and a certain petite woman with chestnut hair and warm brown eyes are a big reason why. I say, reaching for another cookie. I hope that means you'll be staying here permanently, Mrs. Caldwell says. I'm sure Sophie would appreciate that. The heat rises up my neck and into my ears. She impresses me every single day. How so? Mrs. Caldwell's gaze intensifies, and I don't doubt she's watching for anything that might give away my true feelings for the beloved postmaster. With her passion for this project. I stare out the window and recall her excitement when we found the journal. And her people skills. Without her, I wouldn't have met you, and I don't think Miss Betty would have made the connection to the tale her grandmother told her all these years ago. Mrs. Caldwell nods. She's a kind person. Everyone loves Sophie Martin. It's been that way since she was a little girl. Did you know that she used to sit up on the counter in the post office stamping letters for her father and grandfather? I can't help smiling, an image of a little girl with pigtails forming in my mind's eye. The same one I pictured yesterday in the old town hall. I can see that. Mrs. Caldwell cackles. I'm sure you can. You're good for her, you know. I sit up. I am? You are, and I should be going. Keep the letters, she says, struggling to get to her feet. And the cookies. Let me help you. I hold out my hand, and she takes it. I hope everything will work out for the two of you, Mrs. Caldwell says as she shrugs into the coat I hold out for her. You make a nice couple. Her words are such a surprise that I almost let go of the coat. We're not dating, she asks, turning to face me. Looks to me like you are. Before I can think of a response, she's gone and I stand there in my cold hall, thinking that I wouldn't mind dating Sophie Martin. Come on in. Sophie opens the door wearing a long wool sweater and a pair of black leggings that draw my attention to her legs as she walks inside. I'm tempted to step back into the chilly temperature of the darkness outside. Instead, I embrace the warmth and light that's her home and follow Sophie and the heavenly scent that emanates from the kitchen. I hope you like chicken. She pulls an apron over her head. Who doesn't? Especially one that makes my stomach growl before the meal leaves the oven. It's nothing fancy. Sophie opens the oven and pulls out a bird that's golden brown and resting on a bed of root vegetables. It looks amazing to me. I step closer. And smells even better. My stomach growls loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Sophie laughs. Grab a plate and let's eat. A woman of my own heart. Neither of us wastes time filling our plate. Sophie pours us each a glass of Chardonnay. Enjoy. She watches me take the first bite. It's delicious. The chicken melts in my mouth and the vegetables are cooked to perfection. Not too soft, with plenty of flavor from the herbs and seasonings she used. Best thing I've eaten since I got to Chestnut Creek. Sophie laughs. I don't know if that's high praise or an assault on the culinary scene of my hometown. It's high praise. I raise my glass. This is almost as good as the chicken my grandmother used to roast. Sophie joins in the toast. To your grandmother and a hearty meal on a cold winter's day. We carry our plates to the kitchen, and I insist on doing the dishes after our meal. Would you like some coffee? She asks. Coffee would be nice. And I will need it after the meal if we are going to go through the stack of diaries and ledgers one of the men from the Historical Society dropped off at the post office earlier today. Coming right up. We carry our cups into the living room where Sophie spreads out the new source material on a wide coffee table. I rummage through the piles and get comfortable in an oversized chair. The journal is from a few decades after James's departure, and part of a private family collection we haven't seen yet. Take a look at this. I lean over, pointing out a particularly interesting passage that speaks of financial trouble for the mercantile. Sophie listens intently as I read the entry to her, then reaches for the journal. Our fingers touch in the exchange and my gaze searches out hers. Her eyes are hooded and her breathing speeds up. I detect the faintest hint of pink in Sophie's cheeks. With the store in trouble, it makes sense that Elizabeth's father wanted the banker's help, she says, rereading the section. It does. It might explain why Elizabeth didn't wait for James's return. I take a sip of my coffee before picking up another leather-bound book. As we continue to read and share passages with each other, I can't help glancing over at her. In the soft light of the lamps, she practically glows. Mrs. Caldwell's words keep running through my mind. Maybe the woman is right. Sophie and I would make a good couple. We certainly work well together on this project. Look at this, Sophie says, a little while later. We've made good progress and are down to a stack of old business ledgers. I look up from my own reading as she pulls out several old letters from in between the pages. What do they say? I ask, my interest piqued. They are from an E. Townsend. You don't think? Her hands are shaking when she holds two of the letters out to me. They could be. I get up and walk over to join her on the couch for a better look. The dates are right. I'm afraid to open them, Sophie says. And be disappointed if they aren't from Elizabeth. Would you like me to? I take the first of the letters from her. The envelope is cut open and the page inside slips out easily. The writing is delicate, clearly done by a woman's hand. Looks like a letter written to a close friend. I read it out loud, the contents typical for the correspondence of the period. She sounds so sad, Sophie says after a passage that details her sorrow about James's departure. Reading between the lines, it is obvious that her father didn't approve of the relationship and began to push for an engagement to Charles shortly after James left Chestnut Creek. She does, doesn't she? I hand the second letter to Sophie. Would you like to read this one? She does, and I listen intently to her voice as she reads an account of what happened sent to her aunt. Here she is much more accepting and speaks of her duties as a daughter. It suggests to me that after the initial shock, Elizabeth was more pragmatic about her situation than devastated. This doesn't sound like her at all. Sophie shakes her head and puts the letter down. Can you imagine the pressure she must have been under? For the period, this is actually a much more typical response, I say, drawing on my academic background. Love matches were rare, even here. My guess is that she did what she needed to do to keep the store afloat. And I think she's much more likely to confess her true feelings to a friend than to her father's sister. Sophie's eyes are drawn together and there's a challenge there I didn't see before. I disagree. I bite my tongue and keep the fact that I'm the professional here to myself. Judging by the way Sophie scoots away from me, she's got the message, regardless. I close my eyes for a moment and then return to my original seat. Every bone in my body tells me that I should draw on every bit of historical knowledge to make sure we get as close to the truth of what happened to these two people as possible. Yet I'm also acutely aware of how important this love story has become, not just to Sophie, but to everyone in town who has been following along. Sophie speaks the exact moment I do. There's something I need to say. I square my shoulders and look deep into her beautiful eyes. If you don't mind. She nods, crossing her arms in front of her chest. I'm sorry. Sometimes I get so caught up in the research and facts that I forget about the human element. And to be perfectly honest, we will never know for certain which of the accounts are more likely to reflect Elizabeth's true feelings. Sophie's features relax. I see your point, and while I want her to be madly in love with James, you are the expert. In that case, I suggest we show both sides and let people make up their own minds. People? Sophie looks surprised. I chuckle. There's so much interest in this, I can't cross town without someone stopping me to ask about James and Elizabeth. I think we owe it to present our findings to anyone interested. Oh. Her lips are pursed and her eyes are wide with surprise. I tear my gaze away when the old grandfather clock in the corner chimes. I should be going. It's getting late. I'll walk you to the door, Sophie says. Can I kiss you goodnight? I ask when we stand in her foyer. Sophie nods and I dip my head, fully aware we're standing only a few feet away from the spot I almost kissed her the other night. My lips brush across hers and I finally get the taste I've been waiting for since that moment. Her mouth is soft and sweet, her body melting against mine as we lose ourselves in a kiss I won't soon forget. I'm still walking on cloud 9 when I get to my house, the chilly night air doing much to cool my blood. I stop at the mailbox on my way in and find the last thing I expect. A letter from Princeton University.
Chapter 7. Sophie. Grilled cheese and tomato soup? I ask when I step into the kitchen of the house I grew up in. You're the best. Mom smiles and pulls me into a tight hug. You've been working too hard and not sleeping enough. I shrug. She isn't wrong. Between the last of the holiday rush at the post office and the research into James and Elizabeth's lives, I've gotten less shut-eyed than usual. I'm fine. I promise. You do have a certain glow about you. Mom steps back for a better look. I've been hearing some rumors around town. Anything you want to tell me? Can we have lunch before you start with the interrogation? I ask, smiling to soften my words. I think we better. Mom serves us each a bowl of the thick soup and cuts my grilled cheese sandwich in triangles, the way she's always done. I like Ben, I say after we're halfway finished with our meal. But? Mom looks at me across her bowl, spoon hovering halfway between it and her mouth. I have the woman's full and undivided attention. I don't know if things between us are going to work out. I take another bite of my sandwich. Pure comfort food. Oh, honey. No one ever does. You have to be willing to take a risk if you want to find true love. Mom shakes her head. I know, but this is different. I put my spoon down and lean back in the familiar kitchen chair. We are different. He's an academic. I'm a mail delivery person. You are the postmaster of Chestnut Creek and an all-around lovely person. Ben Harper would be lucky to have you in his life. Her expression is so deadly serious, it makes me laugh. I'm not sure he feels the same way. Except the kiss we shared last night gave me hope that he might. Besides, Mom continues, ignoring my words. Being different isn't a bad thing. It usually makes for an interesting relationship. I raise an eyebrow. Look at your father and I. We're like day and night, oil and water, Mom says. She isn't wrong. Her free spirit and musical talent are in stark contrast to my father's organized and career-driven traits. Don't give up on something that might be wonderful, Mom says when she hugs me. Goodbye. Even if it doesn't last, the memories will be yours to keep. I think about those words as I make my way back to the post office. Sophie. I turn, stunned to see Ben rushing across the street toward me. I was on my way to meet you. He points to the building that's been my one and only place of employment. Unless you count my summer job serving ice cream to tourists. What's up? I ask. The man looks far too excited to only be missing me. Besides, it's been a mere 14 hours since our kiss. I have to show you something. He looks around. Let's get out of the cold, though. Do you have time for a quick cup of coffee? I glance at my watch and shake my head. Afraid not. I've been gone too long already. I can make us a cup at the office if you'd like. Ben nods and we stride down the road, coats pulled tightly until we get to the old building. It's warm and cheery inside, and surprisingly quiet. Abby heads out for her own lunch break the moment I return, leaving the two of us on our own. Let me put on some coffee, I say, shrugging out of my winter coat. Ben puts a hand on my arm. It can wait. I want to show this to you first. He reaches into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulls out an envelope. For a moment, I think he found another document. Another source to help us uncover Elizabeth and James's story. A small part of me hopes it's a marriage certificate, proving that true love wins in the end. Then I notice the crisp white paper and modern postmark. What is it? I ask. He hands me the opened letter. The paper is thick with the letterhead of Princeton University at the top. I scan its contents, struggling to grasp what I'm reading. It's a job offer? Ben nods, the biggest smile spreading across his handsome face. Not just any offer. This is the position of my dreams. Teaching and researching early colonial history. Wow. The implications of the offer slowly filter into my brain. That's great. It is, isn't it? I don't think his smile can get any bigger until it does. It was totally unexpected. I guess the current chair decided to retire early. I hand the letter back to him and swallow hard. That's amazing. Congratulations. What about us? Ben asks, some of the joy leaving his eyes. I swallow hard and shrug. What about us? We shared one kiss. No big deal. You should take the job. Before Ben can respond, several customers walk inside. He waits around for a moment and then waves and leaves, leaving me to untangle the complicated mess of feelings swirling in my chest. By the time things quiet down, I'm a hot mess. Then realization hits me like a ton of bricks. Last night we agreed to present our findings about the love letter to the town. Earlier today, we talked to the mayor and the historical society. And tomorrow afternoon, I have to stand up and present our findings with Ben in the old town hall in front of the entire town. My hands shake when I grab my phone from my purse. I send a quick text to Ben, telling him that I'll meet him there. Then I shut off my phone and leave, locking the post office behind me. The afternoon of the presentation comes much too quickly. I've barely had a chance to process the fact that Ben will leave at the first of the year. No matter how often I repeat the words I said to him to myself, they refuse to sink in. All I can think about is the one kiss we shared and the possibility of what could have been. If he wasn't leaving to teach at a prestigious university up north. I see him before he notices me. Ben is dressed in a wool suit and tie, looking so handsome. It makes my heart come to a shuddering stop. I stand there, watching him, committing every tiny detail of this man to memory until he looks up. A smile flashes across his face, then his guard goes up. The experience is painful. So far, everything has been easy and effortless between us. Not anymore. Hey. I walk up and wave awkwardly at the man I thought might be my happily ever after. My ride or die. The thought is ridiculous. We barely know each other. Hello? His tone is as stiff as his posture. Ready to do this? I nod when my grandfather approaches. I'll see you out there. Ben motions to the podium someone set up in front of rows of chairs that are quickly filling with townsfolk eager to hear more about James and Elizabeth. I wanted to come over and wish you good luck, Grandpa says. Not that you need it. Thanks. I look from him to Ben and back, feeling nervous. My hands are sweating, and I feel like I can't get enough air. It has nothing to do with the fact that I have to stand in front of a group of people and talk, and everything to do with the man I'll be presenting alongside. What's wrong? Grandpa asks, putting a hand on my shoulder. I scoff. There's no need to be nervous. We're all friends here. Nothing is wrong. I square my shoulders and force a smile on my lips. I'll be fine. Go get M. Grandpa gives me a gentle push toward the podium, and I stride up with as much confidence as I can muster. Ready? Ben asks when I join him. I nod. Thank you for coming to tonight's presentation. I'm sure most of you have heard about James Miller and Elizabeth Townsend over the past few weeks and the letter that drew them to our attention in the first place. A murmur of agreement runs through the crowd. Why don't we start by having Sophie read the letter to you, since she's the one that found it and started on this historical treasure hunt? Ben steps back, giving me the floor. I've read the letter so many times, I can almost recite it from memory. Aside from my voice, the entire space is quiet, each of the residents in attendance listening intently. Even the members of the Historical Society who have seen the letter and heard most of the story are captivated. As I speak, more and more people flow into the room, filling every empty space. Quite a few of them are standing against the back wall. When I finish, I turn to Ben. Can you believe how many people showed up? He shakes his head. I knew there was a lot of interest, but this is surprising. I wonder how many of them are related to either Elizabeth or James. I gaze across the room, recognizing most of the faces in the crowd. I don't know how many of them can trace their origins back to either the Millers or the Townsends, but many of them come from the town's founding families. I'm sure a lot of them do, Ben says, pulling out a thick stack of notes. It would explain the interest. That and the fact that there isn't much of anything else going on and everyone's off for the holidays. Somehow, Christmas snuck up on me this year. Between work and solving the mystery of the lost love letter, I didn't realize until this morning that Christmas is in a few days. I watch Ben as he lays out a rough timeline for the founding of Chestnut Creek. He talks about the arrival of the Townsend and Miller families, illustrating his words with the maps my grandfather shared with us. I speak of the early days of Townsend Mercantile, while he flashes old pictures on the screen behind us. We show everything we've discovered, and several of the members of the Historical Society nod their approval as we move along. Miss Betty has a front row seat, handkerchief at the ready, soaking up every single word and every document we share with the crowd. Next, we would like to share with you 2 letters we believe Elizabeth wrote, Ben says, handing a copy of one of them to me. The first is written to a close friend, the second to her aunt. From what we can tell, they were penned around the same time and give us a glimpse into the young woman's mind. I read the letter Elizabeth wrote to her friend, struggling with the fact that my own emotional turmoil mirrors that of the woman who lived and died well over a century ago. As you can see, their feelings were mutual, and she wanted to wait for him. And then we have this. Ben reads the letter to her aunt. Here we see a different side of Elizabeth. She's loyal to her father and feels obligated to help keep his business afloat during a time of economic struggle. A murmur goes through the crowd. People turn to look at each other, and even from over here, it is clear that Elizabeth's struggle resonates deeply with the audience. Which do you think represents her true feelings? A young woman asked, promoting a discussion among the attendants, similar to the one Ben and I had in my living room not that long ago. Ben holds up his hand. We can't know for sure, but I believe both sentiments are true. What happened to them? Another person calls, all the way from the back wall. Great question. Ben turns to me, his eyes blazing with excitement. Thanks to a last-minute discovery in the records of the old church, we are finally able to answer your question. You found it? I am stunned. We've been searching for a clue about who Elizabeth ended up marrying anywhere we could think of. Ben nods and turns back to face the crowd. He pulls open an old registry. Thanks to the Reverend who spent all day yesterday combing through the attic of the old parsonage, we now know when Elizabeth Townsend got married. The entire room is silent when he pauses, and I forget to breathe. And to whom? He runs his fingers over the entries. Don't draw it out like that, young man, my grandfather calls in a booming voice. Tell us who the woman wed. On December 24, 1823, Elizabeth Townsend and James Miller. The crowd bursts into a huge round of cheers that drown out the rest of Ben's words. We look at each other, and there is nothing but joy between us. They really got married? I mouth over the noise. They did. Ben steps aside so I can see the evidence for myself. Sure enough, there is the entry, written in the clear hand of the clergy. Despite all odds. Despite all odds. The words give me a strange sense of hope. Maybe not all is lost. I would like to talk, if you don't mind, Ben says, stepping closer so I can hear him. The noise from the crowd is dying down, but there's still plenty of chatter. I tried to call. I needed time. This close to Ben, I can't deny that what I said yesterday was a blatant lie. The kiss is a big deal. As big as the letter James wrote and Elizabeth never received. If they could have their happily ever after against all odds, maybe we can as well.
Chapter 8. Ben. The revelation of the wedding between James and Elizabeth has the effect I knew it would have. The crowd is riveted, and Sophie looks as pleased as the rest of the Chestnut Creek residents. I'm sure a big goofy grin is plastered all over my face. And I can't keep my eyes off Sophie. She looks radiant and perfect. Like this is where she belongs. Here in the town that has harbored generations of her family. Here among people who love and respect her as much as I do. Eventually, everyone calms down, and I can finish out our presentation. That's everything we have for you folks. I'm sure some of you have questions. I scan the crowd and see several heads nodding. Others raise their hand or murmur their agreement. I suggest we take a quick 10-minute break and then reconvene for a question and answer session. I turn to Sophie. This isn't something we discussed. I didn't get the chance after our last conversation when I dropped a bombshell on her. If that works for you. Sounds good to me. I know I have a few questions for you myself. Sophie smiles, and as much as I wish it was otherwise, there's a distance between us that wasn't there 2 days ago. Can I talk to you for a moment? I ask. Outside? She nods, and I find a quiet corner on the far side of the building. It's out of the wind, and the last rays of the afternoon sun warm the thick brick behind us. I'm sorry about ghosting you, Sophie says before I can speak. That wasn't fair. Especially not with this coming up. I can't say that I've enjoyed the radio silence, but I can understand it. And it wasn't fair of me to share the offer from Princeton the way I did. I got overexcited and didn't think how it would affect you after. After our kiss, she asks, her voice barely a whisper. To me, it was more than a simple kiss goodnight. What we have, I say, struggling for the first time today to find the right words. I swallow hard. What we have is special. As special as the connection between James and Elizabeth. Sophie's lips twitch up into a smile. I thought you said we could never be sure exactly how they felt. I think I'm ready to change my mind on that stance, I say. Scientist's prerogative. Each new piece of information makes you question any previous conclusions. Sophie raises an eyebrow in a questioning look, so adorable I'm tempted to pull her in for another kiss. And what piece of information made you change your mind about this? Sophie asks. Proof that they got married in the end. I tick my head in the direction of the hall and the register that's still sitting on the podium. To defy her father and wait for James. It had to be true love. Sophie smiles. Yes. I take a step closer, ready to share my news. I've declined the offer from Princeton. Why? She looks stunned. Because I'm falling in love with you, Sophie Martin, and like Elizabeth and James, I want to see if I can make a life with you here in Chestnut Creek. You don't think you'll come to regret that decision? Her voice is barely a whisper. I shake my head. You might. I don't want to be the reason you miss the opportunity of a lifetime, Sophie says. You might come to resent it down the road. I shake my head again. I won't, I promise. How can you be sure? Because teaching at Princeton is an old dream, I say, sharing the realization I had when I walked home after sharing the news with Sophie. I have a new one now. One in a place that already feels like home. Chestnut Creek, she asks, her voice shaking. Chestnut Creek. I take her hands in mine, needing her to hear me and believe how serious I am about all of this. I talked to my publisher this morning. The company who hired me to write the book that brought me here. Okay? They are impressed with what I've submitted so far. I squeeze her chilled fingers, wrapping my hands tightly around them to share the warmth I feel deep inside. Impressed enough that they offered me a deal for 2 more books. And they are interested in James and Elizabeth's story. They are? They have? Sophie's eyes are so full of hope, I can hardly wait to be done with this event and make her mine for good. An idea begins to form, and I let go of her hands. Before either of us can continue our conversation, her grandfather's voice rings out. Are you 2 lovebirds about done back there? There are some folks with questions, me included. He isn't kidding. We spend a good 90 minutes talking to residents, showing our sources, and responding to every single inquiry. Before we let you go, there is one more question I need to deal with, I say, my hand reaching into the inside pocket of my jacket. In fact, it's time for me to ask a question. The crowd gasps even louder than when I announce the marriage of James and Elizabeth when I turn and drop down on one knee. Sophie Martin, will you marry me? I pull out a small velvet-covered box and open it, revealing the antique diamond ring I bought this morning. It smells like Christmas when I walk into Sophie's family home. Merry Christmas. My little chestnut firecracker rises on her toes and kisses me in front of the entire Martin family gathered around a tall Douglas fir. Merry Christmas. Again. I grin, thinking about how we had celebrated just the 2 of us last night, staying up late huddled by the fire at my place, watching It's a Wonderful Life together. Merry Christmas, Ben, her father says, motioning for me to join him on the spacious family couch. I take a seat and Sophie snuggles in beside me. Don't you 2 look cozy? Mrs. Martin walks in, followed by Sophie's grandmother, both of them wearing aprons. Dinner is almost ready. Here, have some cookies in the meantime. Holiday dinner at the Martin house is a serious affair, and by the end of it, I feel like a stuffed goose. I don't remember the last time I ate this much. I pat my stomach and resist the urge to unbutton my dress pants. I do, Sophie's grandfather says. Thanksgiving. At least we get a bit of a break from the feasting. Sophie's father, who's as thin as a rail, reaches across the table for another slice of cranberry cake. I don't know where the man's been putting all this food, but it's impressive. That all depends on when Sophie and Ben have their big day, her mother says, taking a sip of the sweet spiced wine she served with dessert. Have the 2 of you set a date yet? Give those young folks some time, Sophie's grandfather says. They've been engaged for less than a week. It's never too early to start making plans, his wife adds, slapping the old man's hand when he reaches for another slice of pecan pie. You need to watch your sugar. It's a little late for that, Sophie mutters under her breath. We're thinking next Christmas. I reach for her hand under the table and squeeze it. Christmas Eve would be nice. As would be sharing a wedding anniversary with the couple who had brought us together. That's a lovely idea. Sophie's mother's eyes light up. There's nothing more romantic than a Christmas bride. I saw a picture of a fur-lined cape the other day. Artificial, of course. The three women put their heads together and start talking about venues for both the wedding and the reception. They are going to be busy for the next little while hatching plans, Sophie's father says. Why don't we head back to the living room? I have a nice bottle of brandy tucked away. It's about time we welcome you properly into the family, young man. That sounds nice. I follow both of the Martin men, and the three of us settle in, drink in hand, soft holiday music playing in the background. As I sip my drink, I count my blessings and reflect on how far I've come since the day I first arrived in Chestnut Creek. Back then, this town had been nothing more than a point on a map. A spot and temporary stop in my research. Today it is so much more than that. Chestnut Creek has become my home. And my future.
Epilogue. Sophie. Chestnut Creek, Christmas Eve, 1 year later. Ready? My mother walks into the bedroom where Abby is putting the finishing touches on my hair and makeup. As ready as I'll ever be. I rise from the chair and catch a glimpse of myself in my grandmother's wedding dress. It's a stunning piece from the 40s, and the veil Abby attached to the antique cones in my hair is a family heirloom. For generations of Martin brides have worn it before me, including my mother and grandmother. You look beautiful. Mom has tears in her eyes and Grandma is already using the embroidered handkerchief she tucked into her purse for the service. Thank you. I feel like the perfect blushing bride, and deep down, I can't wait to see the look on Ben's face when I walk down the aisle. I shrug into the fake fur-lined cape my mother ordered months ago. It's the same ivory color as my wedding dress. Let's not forget your flowers. Abby hands me the bouquet of snowdrops and white roses before the four of us head into the living room to join my father and grandfather. Aren't you a sight to behold? Grandpa walks up and kisses me on the cheek. As beautiful as your grandmother on the day I married her. The look the two of them exchange says it all. A love that lasts decades. It's what I hope Ben and I have in store for us. We better get going, Dad says. Unless you plan on keeping Ben waiting. And give him a chance to get cold feet? I don't think so. I grin when I see my father's shocked expression. Only joking. That man isn't going anywhere. He's not the only one waiting. Dad holds out his arm and I take it. Mom and Abby help me get into Grandpa's '57 Chevy, and on the drive to the old Episcopal church where James and Elizabeth got married, it starts to snow. Could this be any more perfect? Mom asks when we exit. She gently raises the hood of the cape over my head and veil. Do you think this is what it was like for them? Abby asks, adjusting my dress. I like to think so. I take my father's arm again and watch Mom and Grandma enter the church. Abby takes her position in front of me, and we enter the church. Oh. The sight in front of me takes my breath away. Mrs. Caldwell and the rest of the Historical Society have outdone themselves. Hundreds of candles light the space, their flames reflecting off the stained glass windows and heavy stone walls. It gives the space a magical glow and permeates the air with a hint of melting wax. It mingles with the garlands of flowers that are strung everywhere. Soft music begins to play and I walk on my father's arm down the aisle, smiling faces greeting me as we pass family and friends gathered for this most special of celebrations. But I only have eyes for one face. Ben's. The man who will be my husband in a few moments stands in front of the altar. Sean, his best man, is by his side. The two have become fast friends since our talk at the old town hall. With each step, I get a better look at Ben's face. His eyes are wide and the moment his gaze connects with mine, the sweetest smile spreads across his face. He takes an involuntary step forward, checking himself and returning to his original position. Warmth at his eagerness for me to join him, for the ceremony and in life, warms my heart. I'm as ready for this as he is. The preacher, the man who'd spent hours digging through torn boxes and old grates to find the wedding registry that proved James and Elizabeth had gotten married here in this building, steps down to meet me. I leave my father's side and take my place next to Ben. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the presence of these witnesses, to join Sophie and Ben in matrimony, which is an honorable estate, instituted of love and dedicated to the mutual joy of those who enter into it, the preacher says, his voice ringing through the packed church. Therefore, it is not to be entered into unadvisedly or lightly, but reverently and soberly. Into this estate these two persons present come now to be joined. If anyone can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. It is so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. When there is no objection, he continues. Sophie and Ben, as you stand before us, it is important that you understand that the vows you are about to exchange serve as a verbal representation of the love you have promised to each other. Words are fleeting, but the promises you make today must be lived out day by day. These vows are meant to be a lifelong commitment, through all the days of your lives. I reach over and take Ben's hand. He squeezes it in silent support. We're here. Together. Getting married on Christmas Eve. My heart beats so fast and loud it's hard to focus on the preacher's words when he turns to face Ben. Ben, do you take Sophie to be your lawfully wedded wife, to live together in the covenant of marriage? Do you promise to love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, be faithful unto her as long as you both shall live? I do. Ben's voice is firm, and I have no doubt that every single person can hear him. I clear my throat, readying myself for my part and grateful we decided not to speak our own vows. The preacher turns to face me, a kind smile on his face. Sophie, do you take Ben to be your lawfully wedded husband, to live together in the covenant of marriage? Do you promise to love him, comfort him, honor and keep him, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, be faithful unto him as long as you both shall live? I do. My voice shakes a little, but my words are clear. Most importantly, I mean them more than I ever thought possible. May I have the rings, please? The preacher asks. Abby rushes forward and places them in the man's outstretched hand. He blesses them with the sign of the cross. These rings are a symbol of eternity and the unbroken circle of love. Love freely given has no beginning and no end. May these rings serve as a reminder of the feelings you have for each other today and forever. Ben picks up the smaller of the two gold bands and slips it onto my finger. With this ring, I thee wed. Let it ever be to us a symbol of our love. My hands shake when I pick up his ring and for a brief moment, I'm terrified that I'll drop it. With this ring, I thee wed. Let it ever be to us a symbol of our love, I say, echoing his words while I slide it on. By the power vested in me by the state and being witnessed by your friends and family, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may now kiss the bride. Ben leans down and whispers, we did it. I let out a nervous giggle before he leans over and covers his mouth with mine. It is a quick kiss. Short and sweet, and perfectly appropriate for the occasion. And I'm having none of it. I wrap my arms around my husband's neck and pull him closer for a real kiss. Laughter erupts around us, but it is nothing compared to the deep joy I feel in my heart. Sean coughs and finally puts a hand on Ben's shoulder. Maybe save some of that for later? I reach up and wipe a bit of lipstick from Ben's lips before taking a steadying breath. He takes my hand in his and together we turn to face everyone who came to witness our union. The preacher chuckles. Clearly, this isn't the first time he's had to deal with an exuberant bride. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you for the first time, Mr. and Mrs. Ben and Sophie Harper. Hand in hand, we descend the steps and join family and friends who are eager to congratulate us and wish us a very Merry Christmas. Enjoying yourself, Mrs. Harper? Ben asks, spinning me around the room for the fourth time. You can't tell? I'm sure the huge smile on my face tells him everything he needs to know. Ben chuckles and drops me into a deep dip when the song ends. I could venture a guess. The dimple on his left cheek that I love almost as much as my new husband makes an appearance. Tell me over a cold drink. All the dancing and laughing leaves me craving a glass of ice-cold bubbly. We stroll arm in arm through the old town hall. The Historical Society and a host of other volunteers have gone all out to return the inside of the building to its former glory. And by some miracle everything got done in time to host our reception here. I can't shake the feeling that a certain Chestnut Creek couple has been looking out for us from above. Beautiful wedding. Sean walks up and hands us each a glass. Congratulations. Again. Thank you. I accept it gratefully. Are you having a good time? Sean nods, his eyes roaming the room. You have outdone yourself, Sophie. I laugh. I wish I could take credit, but Abby did almost all of it. If you ever need a maid of honor, I can highly recommend her. Sean chuckles, but there's no joy in his eyes. I doubt I'll need one of those, or a best man anytime soon. Well, I'm grateful you stood up there with me. Ben puts his arm around the man who'd become his best friend over the past year. I know this wasn't easy. Sean nods. Anything for you. Marriage looks good on you both. Don't lose faith. If you'd have told me when I first came to Chestnut Creek I'd find the love of my life here and get hitched, I wouldn't have believed it. Ben holds up his hand, the gold band sparkling in the light of the lamps that come to light all around us. It's going to happen for you. I firmly believe that. Sean scoffs. And I seriously doubt it. A lot can happen in a year. Ben puts a hand on his friend's shoulder. Maybe so, but for now, I'll settle for dancing with your beautiful bride, he says, turning to me. If you don't mind. You'll have to ask her. Ben grins. His eyes don't leave me the entire time I dance with Sean. He's right, you know. I give Sean an encouraging smile. A lot can happen in a year. Who knows? You might find your own happily ever after. I already have, he mutters as the song comes to a close. Or at least I thought I did. The end. This has been The Holiday Letter. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2024 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2024 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.